Hi guys, it's Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Marc Zicree of Space Command, and Marc Zicree of Star Trek, and Marc Zicree of Twilight Zone Companion, and Marc Zicree of many other things. Today, we're going to talk about a very special episode of Black Mirror called USS Callister. And many of you probably already know about this episode. Black Mirror is a anthology series that has been on for several seasons now, and it's created by Charlie Brooker, and it's an amazing show. I really think it's the natural inheritor of Twilight Zone's mantle, but it's very dark. And the great thing is that it really addresses modern issues, modern events, modern subjects in a way that is very different from what Twilight Zone would have done, the original Twilight Zone. I think a lot of the successors to Twilight Zone that have tried to be a new Twilight Zone have failed because they're just kind of going over old turf, old territory, sort of second-rate versions of Twilight Zone. Whereas I think what Black Mirror does is it attacks things in a way that Rod Serling wouldn't have done in terms of sexuality, in terms of language, in terms of just everything. It's very modern, very 21st century. That said, the difference between Black Mirror and Twilight Zone, I think, is that Rod Serling was enormously compassionate as a human being and as a writer. He, although he went into very dark terrain on some Twilight Zone episodes, he really was rooting for humanity. He had a great sympathy for the little guy. He was not a snob, nor was he cynical in any way, shape, or form. And so the humanity of Twilight Zone, the compassion of Twilight Zone, the heart of Serling, and the fact that it's a hopeful message, despite some of the darker episodes and the times in which Twilight Zone was shot, the civil rights movement, the darkest period of the Cold War, and the threat of nuclear destruction, Rod believed that humanity could emerge better. He believed that there was a possibility of a very good future, and he was advocating very much for that future through his work. I think that Black Mirror is a very dark show generally, and that often it has a cynical edge. It has I don't mean to be overly critical of it because I think it's a great show, and I think it's brilliantly done, and the level of production on it, the level of acting, really great stuff. And again, shows episodes, stories you've never seen before. There's an episode I talked about previously called San Junipero that is a positive episode, a hopeful episode, a very, very good episode that won an Emmy, and deservedly so. So now Callister, I've been hearing about USS Callister for a while now, a few months. I knew it was going to be commenting on Star Trek, particularly Star Trek The Next Generation, and more specifically the original Star Trek and its tropes, and dealing with the issues of fandom. And so I watched it, and it's a very good job, but again, dark, and so it's but the look is great, the design is great. So let's just jump into it. It stars Jesse Plemons, who many of you will know from such TV shows as Breaking Bad, Fargo, Friday Night Lights. He played a young version of Matt Damon's character in All the Pretty Horses, and so he looks kind of like a pudgy, younger Matt Damon, and of course, he does a Shatner in this. He does a riff on Shatner that's fun and well observed. But also, when I was watching, I thought, okay, this is not just inspired by Star Trek. It's inspired by It's a Good Life, which is a very famous episode of Twilight Zone starring Bill Mumy, in which a little boy has enormous psychic powers and basically terrorizes a town, that he has total control over those people. And in fact, in an interview recently, Charlie Brooker acknowledged that he recently saw that episode and it was an inspiration. Bill Mumy told me, of course, that when he shot the episode, since I wrote the Twilight Zone Companion, that the way he would memorize lines when he was a little kid was his mom would read the script to him and he'd memorize his lines. So he didn't just know all of his lines, he knew everybody's lines. And so when they were doing the table read of that episode around the table, at one point, one of the other actresses didn't know her lines, and he knew the lines, and she was not amused. So that was Cloris Leachman, and so really fun stuff. So, and again, if you want to hear my commentary on It's a Good Life, just get the Blu-ray, and I do a commentary on that episode. But it was based on a very famous short story by Jerome Bixby, who also wrote the script of the Mirror Mirror episode of Star Trek that dealt with the evil mirror universe, and it's a great episode of the original Star Trek. And so there's a very interesting lineage to USS Callister from Jerome Bixby to Twilight Zone to Star Trek to USS Callister. So essentially the plot of USS Callister is you have a gaming genius who has invented a game that takes place in outer space, and he has his own version that's a riff on USS Callister, which was a science fiction Star Trek-like show that he's a huge fan of from his childhood. And he's sort of a nerdy guy and being screwed over by by his boss and partner and so forth, and surreptitiously he gets DNA samples from his coworkers and creates duplicates in the game that he basically terrorizes and forces to be his crew, and it makes its point, and it's dealing not just with Star Trek, but also gaming and fandom, and the quality of entitlement that many fans feel to do things like trolling and swatting and all of these other things where they basically disagree with people and make their lives a living hell online and in the real world, and he's observing that and talking about that. Now, again, it's a very good episode. There, for me, I have a little bit of a problem when you have someone who's a wonderful person or supposedly a genius, and then they're being screwed over by all of their co-workers, and rather than in an original Twilight Zone, they might eventually rise to the occasion and get some good life for themselves, something that like, for instance, Nightmare 20,000 Feet, everyone thinks Shatner is crazy, and then it turns out that he's right, kills the gremlin, and he's proven to himself and eventually to others that he wasn't crazy. So there's a moral compass. One can say there's a moral compass in Black Mirror as well, because I won't give away the plot too much, but let's just say the people who are being treated badly manage to come together, and they manage to fight back. And so there's that. Now, also, by the way, just a little side note, Aaron Paul, who was one of the stars of Breaking Bad, has a cameo in this where he plays the voice of a gamer at the end of the episode, and so that's also very fun. Now, I've heard that rumblings that USS Callister has been greenlighted as a spin-off series. Very interesting, because when I saw it, I was thinking, what have they done with those sets? I'd like them. But so if it becomes a show, that'll be an interesting companion to the Orville and Star Trek Discovery and Space Command, for that matter, because we're all taking this Star Trek riff and commenting on it in a different way. And it's very interesting how many of us have both been creators of emblematic episodes of Star Trek, like Ron Moore and Brandon Braga and so forth, and then gone on to do our own versions or our own commentaries on that show and on that universe. So, for instance, Ron did, when he reinvented Battlestar Galactica, Ron Moore, that was basically the anti-Star Trek. That was his commentary on, okay, let's see if we take this and reverse it, what that would be like. And certainly with Space Command, I'm giving a tip of the hat to Star Trek, but also bringing it into the modern era and dealing with the issues of today in a very specific way and projecting out into the future. And the Orville, of course, is the attempt to sort of a mashup of Star Trek and the comedic sensibilities of the modern day, whereas Star Trek Discovery takes it into a much darker place. And now they have episode 10 debuting tonight, and so I'll start watching those and commenting on those shortly, and on the later episodes of the Orville, and seeing where these shows ultimately end up. But in terms of USS Callister, it's on Netflix here. If you're a subscriber, there's probably other ways to see it if you have friends who have abilities, but not to countenance that. But I think that in Callister, it's basically saying that Star Trek espouses a certain philosophy that many people who are fans do not follow, but it gives them a sense of, well, I'm a Star Trek fan, that makes me a good guy, and so I'm capable of doing terrible things, but justifying it to myself as being the good guy, as being the wronged party. It's interesting also, by the way, that Star Trek, because it was made in the 60s, has the duality of America, and I've commented on this before, which is fascinating because you have them exploring and being the good guys and fighting for good, but every now and then Shatner will just kind of, or Captain Kirk, let's say, will just go to a society, it's a stable society, for instance, a computer's been running it for hundreds of years, everyone seems more or less happy, and then he just blows up the computer and leaves them to, fend for themselves, or he sets up a democracy, quote unquote. And so in a way, Star Trek was also representing the worst of what America was doing in the era in Vietnam and so forth, where they would basically have a sense of, we are imposing our view on other cultures, and we don't really need to find out too much about those cultures. We can just basically stomp all over them, rip up the floorboards, do whatever. Now, to be fair, though, Roddenberry was, of course, a humanist and a liberal, and he called Kirk on that philosophy in certain episodes. For instance, the one with the Organians, where they basically say to both the Klingons and the Federation and Starfleet, we're superior beings, we don't need your help, and we're going to make that stick. And that was, I think, an amazing episode. There's a lot of variety in the original Star Trek in terms of just what it's espousing, because obviously, and this is something that Charlie Brooker deals with in Callister, which is the sexuality that isn't real sex. No one has overt sex in Star Trek. There's a couple of oblique references, oblique moments, but more often it's just a closed-mouth kiss, which the censors at NBC insisted upon at the time. And by the way, for those who don't know this, when Star Trek originally aired, it was on NBC. Now, of course, it's owned by CBS, Paramount, Viacom, so the movies are done by Paramount, the TV show is done by CBS, and is on CBS Interactive or CBS Downloadable or whatever it's called. Whereas it's also showing on Netflix everywhere but America. So, but in Callister, he's commenting on the sexist nature of Star Trek, the short skirts, and the fact that Kirk gets to romance every girl that comes close, or let's say that Jesse Plemons, captain, does, and so it's exploring that. Oh, another great person to look out for in Callister is the actor who there's an actor from Westworld who appears in Callister, and he's great in both. And I met him actually at the Museum of Broadcasting tribute to Westworld a few months ago, and he's a great guy. We got to talk, and I really like him, and I hope to use him in Space Command at some point. But we'll see where that all leads. So again, basically overall, I think USS Callister is a very interesting episode. It's worth everyone taking a look at. Black Mirror will be some people's cup of tea, some people not. I can take it in very small doses. I loved San Junipero, but the other episodes I've seen, they just kind of leave you with a bad taste in your mouth, not because they're not well done and brilliantly done. They make their point, they're commenting on the real world, but they're so dark, and that's deliberately so. But and it's interesting also that Jordan Peele, who did Get Out and is such a brilliant talent, he's been given control of the new Twilight Zone, and I'm about to interview him for the Twilight Zone Companion, for the new Twilight Zone Companion. So he and I are going to sit down and have a talk. Interestingly enough, years ago I wrote, when they brought Twilight Zone back on CBS in the late 80s, the one with George R.R. Martin and Harlan Ellison and Alan Brennett and so forth, brilliant writing staff. I sold them a script called Knife Through the Veil, and Doug Hayes, who did Eye the Beholder and The After Hours and The Howling Man for Twilight Zone, brilliant director, very good friend, he was going to be directing that episode, and it dealt with murder, violence, home invasion, the need for vengeance, and the need of forgiveness. And it was a week before prep. The CBS censors pulled the plug on it, so it was very sad that it never got made. But it's a script I'm very pleased with. At one point, Katie Sackhoff read it, Battlestar Galactica, and she wanted to do it, and that didn't come to fruition, sadly. But I'm going to definitely bring it to the attention of Jordan Peele when he and I talk, and see perhaps if it can get made, because I'd love to see it shot. And now, of course, there'd be no problem with censorship, and it's not hard-edged in the 21st century, in 2018, so we shall see. But so that's about it for now. A lot is happening. We're working on Space Command. We have our VFX team busy at work, and our composer, everybody's busy to finish the 2-hour pilot, and I'm pitching the show now, and we're going to be shooting more of the episodes. I'm writing much more of Space Command, and as well as finishing the new Twilight Zone Companion. I have a book to write called Greenlighting Yourself that will be coming out this upcoming year from Silman James, much ahead. And we'll be talking here about science fiction TV shows, movies, books. If you aren't a subscriber to Mr. Sci-Fi, subscribe, because every week I'm commenting on all of these things. If you want to see my commentary on San Junipero, the other Black Mirror episode, you can just, I'm sure, search under Mr. Sci-Fi and find it. And so for now, that's it. You can see many of my little interesting things on the back wall behind me, including a letter from Gene Roddenberry on original Star Trek stationery, my spacesuit, the Eye of the Beholder mask. The thing above it is a life mask of Leonard Nimoy, and there, of course, just over my shoulder is the photo of Ed Kemmer from Space Patrol and Frankie Thomas from Tom Corbett Space Cadet in the 70s, 20 years after their shows aired. They got back in the old uniforms, took a photo shaking hands, and I had both of them sign autographs to me, and this is one of my prized possessions. So that's it for now. Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi. We'll talk very soon. Feel free to comment. Feel free to reach out to me. And if you want to pledge to Space Command, you can go on spacecommandseries.com to do so, or the Marc Zicree Patreon page. Lots of surprises to come, much ahead. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.